Welcome to Inside Scoop Live, the podcast where indie authors get personal, sharing insights about their books, their writing journeys, and their passions. I'm your host, Sherry Hoyt, and I invite you to join me for engaging conversations with both debut indie authors and seasoned veterans. Whether you're looking for your next great read or a bit of inspiration, you've come to the right place. Let's get started. Hi, everyone. James Crompton joins the show today to talk about his book, The Divine Feminine. It's a deeply personal account of one man's journey from a traumatic Kundalini awakening into an intimate living relationship with the Divine Feminine. Before we get started, here's the inside scoop on the author. James Crompton is a spiritual writer whose work emerges from lived experience rather than doctrine, tracing a personal journey from restlessness and striving into surrender, healing, and mystical union. Writing from a grounded male perspective, James bridges human experience with subtle spiritual realities, speaking to those drawn beyond external success toward inner wholeness and a deeper listening to the body's intelligence. His work invites readers into a felt experience of awakening, where the body becomes a doorway and the divine feminine is encountered not as an idea, but as a living presence. And you can learn more about James Crompton and his work at jamescromptonauthor.com. Well, hi, James. Welcome to Inside Scoop Live.
Hi, Sherry. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to learning more about you and your book. So why don't you first tell us a little bit about your book, The Divine Feminine, From Awakening to Walking in Union, and maybe a little bit of what your inspiration was for writing the book.
Okay, so without wishing to start off totally woo-woo, I didn't really feel like I actually wrote the book. I felt like the book kind of wrote itself.
Yeah.
I'd been getting into spirituality for about 6 years, and I'd got really into meditation. And I had this kind of profound experience, which I kept a diary about as it was progressing. When people often have kind of like awakening experiences, so to speak, they often talk about kind of a dark night of the soul. Initially, I wasn't really sure what was happening to me. I thought maybe I was having like a midlife crisis. And, there was no one to turn to really. And I couldn't find any literature on the kind of things that I was experiencing, even though there is literature. But I think as a man living in the West, when I think if I'd been living in India, people would have understood what was happening. There would have been support groups and things like that potentially, or, things people I could turn to say I was kind of having these experiences in meditation. But I think living in the West, and the way that kind of everything's set up for us, I felt very much alone. So I kept a diary of my experiences, and I really wanted to put a book out that would say help someone like me in my situation.
Yeah.
So that was really like the kind of premise for why I wrote the book in the first place. I never intended to be an author, to be honest with you. I mean, everyone likes the idea of writing a book, but, you got to have a story. And, my father had actually written 3 books, but they were like kind of books on advertising. So there wasn't a kind of a memoir or a story to tell. But
Right.
yeah, so I ended up writing the book about my experiences and just putting it out there just in case anyone else might have, been going through or go through this a similar thing and might find it a kind of comfort to themselves, really.
Right. I've heard before, if you can't find the book you want to read, write it,
Right. Yeah,
which is easier
exactly.
said than done, but,
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So what had happened originally was I realized I'd been through this experience, which is well known in the kind of spiritual field. This is called a Kundalini awakening. And I couldn't find just like honest writings from a man's perspective about this experience. I'm not saying they're not out there. I just found it very difficult to find. There's lots of mystical texts, and at the time, it felt like a very mystical experience. It was really about the first 6 months of the experience when I realized what was happening to me. Actually, that's when it starts. Because before that, I was in quite a dark place and not really understanding what was happening to me. I felt like I felt like I might have been having at some one point I thought I was having a mental breakdown, if I'm being honest.
Yeah. Oh, no.
And
Yeah.
but like I say, these kind of things have been documented by psychiatrists like Jung, and I've since found things that have kind of supported. I'm not sure if supported is the right word, but for me, what it was about was just kind of putting the story down and seeing if it resonates. It's about the divine feminine. A Kundalini awakening is about essentially accessing a level of consciousness that is separate from the ego. It feels autonomous, and it's a way of getting out into the open. What I was trying to find, as I said, when I initially was going through the experience, because at one point I was suicidal.
Mm,
So, in the early days, I was suicidal. The reality started to become unreal. All kinds of strange things happened. Now it's been a year in the process, and it feels like much more integrated. And I'm actually writing a second book now about living with this experience and what it's like to integrate this experience into your everyday life. Because
yeah,
for a while, I considered, becoming a monk, essentially. I kind of woke up and I looked around me at the world, and I'm sure Texas, England are probably not that much difference in terms of rat race and,
right.
keeping up with the Joneses. He's got a Range Rover,
Yeah,
so I've got to get a Range Rover, and all this kind of, and I just thought, I don't really recognize this. It's not something that I can relate to anymore. So I considered, leaving and, essentially becoming a monk.
yeah,
But I have a family and, you can't just walk away. I can't just go, right, that's it. I've had this kind of awakening experience and now I'm
yeah.
leaving.
See ya. Yeah.
Yeah. You know, I think these things, right, Sherry, they come from within. So when I'm talking about the divine feminine, I'm talking about an experience that comes from within your own consciousness. I'm not talking about an external being that's coming down from another planet. I wanted to be clear on that. And I'm not sure whether I actually made that clear in the book. I definitely talked about the mental health side of things in the book, but I talked about kind of synchronicity and experiences which felt, when my brain was finding patterns and meaning in things. But the experience itself very much comes from within. And it's certainly possible to reach levels of consciousness that are autonomous from the ego, which is outside of the ego. 6 years ago, when I first started watching Eckhart Tolle videos, so that's how it started. I was looking for answers because I had a really noisy mind, really noisy. It wouldn't stop, constant thinking, usually negative thoughts. And I was looking for a way out of that. And I'd never tried meditation before. I just thought it was a load of old nonsense, to be honest with you. And actually, in reality, when I first started to meditate, I realized I could go very deep into meditation. And for better or worse, that unlocked something within me that, took me to a completely different place
Yeah.
mentally. So, it's like I say, it's a very personal book. And anyway, hopefully it will resonate with other people. It's very niche.
What made you decide to take that leap and put it in book format and put it out into the world?
I
That's a big step.
So it almost felt like the experience itself wanted the experience to be written. Does that make
Mm,
sense? It's like, it felt like if I sat in a kind of spacious meditation, I would have the feeling that I should tell the story. Do you see what I
right.
mean? It's not like, I'm not saying there's not like a voice in my head going, hey, tell this story to the world, Like, I'm not schizophrenic or anything like that. It just felt like the book kind of, this experience that happened to me, it totally blew me away. I was, brought up in a strict kind of Catholic upbringing,
Hmm.
where God's a white guy with a beard on another planet. And I don't want to be critical of anyone, but what I find really interesting about the Catholic Church is that they call the stories in the Bible parables, but they teach them like they're literal stories.
Right.
They're not literal stories. In my opinion, they're mystical stories. They
Right.
have deeper meanings. As I said, it kind of put me off spirituality.
Yeah.
And I was drawn to the figure of Mary, actually, because I liked the idea of Mother Mary kind of looking down and being gentle and compassionate. And again, I think when I'm talking about the divine feminine, Sherry, right, she appears in a lot of, mystical texts associated with all different kinds of religions. So in the Hindu religion, they call her Shakti. And that's mostly what the book is about. It's about a Kundalini awakening, about the divine mother Shakti. And then in the kind of banned scriptures that the church banned, the heretical scriptures, the Gnostic scriptures, if you, for want of a better word, the Nag Hammadi library, they talk about the divine feminine as Sophia.
Mm,
And I just saw parallels between the two. I think they're talking about the same thing. And then in Sufism, they talk about Layla, And
Oh,
then in Catholic Church, we have the Mother Mary, and they are all kind of representing to me, essentially at their heart, at their roots. And again, this may be a big claim because I'm not a theologist, but it just felt that this is what is being expressed here is the feminine side of God. And again, I don't like using that word God because
hmm,
it brings up so many connotations, doesn't it? It's a way to point to something. The whole thing is a way just to point to something. I
right.
think in the Tao Te Ching, it's called the Great Tao, the flow of life, the conscious flow of life.
Yeah, I mean, people call it different things. Some people call it the universe, some people call it an energy, it's just
Right.
kind of whatever
Yes.
you are comfortable with, you
Yes, I
know.
agree. I agree. And I think awakening is a different experience for every individual. I think there are different types of awakening. Like you can have like what I think someone like Eckhart Tolle, who has what I would call a spacious awakening. So, he's awoken to kind of just presence and spaciousness and, the kind of the shattering of the ego. And I think I had a more of an energetic awakening, referred to a Kundalini awakening, which was much more of a kind of a rising of the energy within, clearing the chakras. I went through a long healing process. And yeah, and now the ego is much, much quieter. I can go through like last week, I had an entire day where I didn't really think about anything, which was just total bliss, in a lot of
Yeah.
ways. I mean, you have to think, right, Sherry, as you know, I'm sure you're busy and you're running a business, right? And you have to be able to coordinate that. And the ego is a useful tool because otherwise you wouldn't be able to function. What I find is about 80% of what I think about on a daily basis is utter nonsense, not required, usually anticipating something that never happens or worrying about something or building a story about something that isn't real, and it was often negative. And I think this is the experience for a lot of people, what they experience of their. And when I talk about the ego, I'm talking about the internal dialogue, the story that everyone tells themselves on a
Oh,
daily
absolutely.
basis.
Yeah.
Now I've got to the stage where I've kind of let go of a lot of trauma, a lot of pain body that I'd built up through my life, especially as a man, not being able to express pain and sorrow as freely as women. I think women are much better at kind of letting out their feelings. And I realized I'd been carrying all this emotion and this tension around with me that was slowly being unraveled by this energetic awakening. And while I was going through it, I just thought my ego is so strong. It's not going to be able to break through. Is this really going to make me calmer? Am I really going to be more like the Buddha? Everyone wants to be the Buddha, right? But it has actually, after a year of going through this process, which is actually unstoppable once it starts, people run into problems with this because they don't understand what's happening to them and they try and fight against it, and it
Yeah.
can cause them pain and things like that. So you just kind of have to surrender to the process.
Yeah, because you have to go through it, right? I mean, you have to experience it.
Once it starts, it doesn't stop. You can't stop it. It's
Yeah.
your life is changing. The way I can describe it again, it feels like the universe is awakening to itself.
Hmm.
So I now feel myself as like, instead of being like little James that does this and does that and plays music and teaches, it's almost like when I'm walking around, I'm present in the moment, experiencing life, not missing life in a kind of internal thought loop that goes round and round and round. It's almost like awakening to consciousness itself, if that makes sense. It's almost like, I'm experiencing life every moment, moment for moment, and just
Yeah.
being present within the moment and not having to be anywhere else or think about anything else.
When you talked about surrender, I'm sure that didn't happen suddenly, or did it? What changed once you stopped resisting and kind of allowed the experience to happen and to continue?
So I'd actually hit rock bottom, I think. I don't want to bore you with all the details, but it was about a 6 year process. I started meditating. I was able to go really deep into meditation. I started to notice a kind of, I think the Hindus call it prana, or I think
Mm,
it's, or chi, life force, where I could take in this energy through the solar plexus. And I was doing it. I thought I was raising my vibration. But actually, what I was doing was I was going into the Kundalini Shakti's kitchen and poking her, and eventually she's going to come out of that kitchen and she's going to smash her over the head with a ladle. And and so I kind of hit rock bottom. I'd gone down the rabbit hole, the Matrix rabbit hole, the Gnostic rabbit hole, conspiracy theories, in a way that was useful to think about the nature of reality in a different way. But I think like I came out of that because That's actually unhelpful. Going around thinking, oh yes, well, this is just a kind of simulation, and
Mm.
we're all just kind of being farmed for our energy, and it's very negative. And it kind of, people that kind of stay down that rabbit hole, it kind of absolves them from any responsibility to the world. It's
Oh,
like, oh,
yeah.
I don't have to care for nature because it's not real, and I don't have to. And I just think that's actually really unhelpful. But I was kind of down in that rabbit hole, and it was very depressing. And I was
Hmm.
experiencing these energetic feelings that felt more real. I could say, oh, yeah, it does feel like we're energetic beings, and we could be being farmed for our energy. And I'm spiraling down and down and downwards, thinking, oh my goodness, this is so negative.
Yeah.
And eventually I just got to the stage where I couldn't go down any further. And I was starting to feel these weird kind of energetic sensations rising up the spine to the skull and then going back down again. And one day I just kind of was like, there's nothing I can do about this. It was weird. It was like kind of, thy will be done are the words that came into my head. I think,
Mm.
there's a lot of deep truth in Christianity, in Orthodoxy. Thy will be done is a very clear, to me, that means, surrender. That
Hmm.
literally means surrender to the one. It doesn't mean, be a good person. Being a good person should just be a natural thing. It means surrendering to the will of the one, if you see what I mean. So that was the phrase that kind of came into my head. Yeah, and that was the moment of surrender when I actually finally realized what happened to me. And then once I discovered that, then I was able to kind of come out of the rabbit hole and come back to some form of normality and function. The Wizard of Oz,
Yeah.
that film is essentially what it's about to me. Dorothy starts off, she gets swept up in this hurricane. She goes to a completely, kind of a crazy place. They try and put her to sleep on the way, right? When she gets to Oz, she looks behind the curtain. She realizes that it's all an illusion. And then she realizes that she had the power to go home all along. Frank Baum knew exactly what he was doing when
That
he
is
wrote that
interesting.
story. That is what the Wizard of Oz is actually about. I think he made it into a children's story and told it to the children because I think if he'd said it to his peers, they would have probably locked him up at the time. So, but when I watched The Wizard of Oz, I was like, wow, that's actually an awakening story disguised as a children's story. And one of the interesting things about that film, I think, wasn't it the first film in color as well, which kind of, I'm not sure about that, but it was certainly a very early film in color, almost like the
Yeah.
lights coming on.
Yeah, because it
So,
started in black and white and then it went to color, didn't it? And
right,
then,
exactly.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah. And
yeah.
that story was very much like the journey that I'd kind of been on, but in a completely separate way, and it's told in fantasy terms. But yeah, when I saw that film, I was like, wow, yeah, Baum knew what he was doing when you wrote that film.
That's so interesting. And I think a lot of children's books are disguised to also inform adults, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Sleeping Beauty is one of them, isn't it? I was talking about, and also Pinocchio.
Yeah.
Someone was telling me about the other day about it becoming animated. Initially starts off as a puppet, and then he becomes conscious. I think it's absolutely there. Are a lot of fairy tales. These tales are ancient folk tales, aren't they? That are told. The people that wrote them down didn't write them
Mm.
mostly, and we're often told these stories, but in the West, it's never explained what these things are. And again, that for me added to the conspiracy at the time because it's like, oh,
Yeah.
yeah, there's a big conspiracy to keep us all asleep and consuming, and because that's what it
Yeah.
feels like, right?
Yeah, we don't go very deep. We stay surface level and don't dig too deep and stir up anything, whereas other
Yeah,
cultures they want to learn, and I don't know. I get
they
what you're
do.
saying. Yeah.
I mean, I think the
Yeah.
only thing that the only thing the British should have stolen from India was the spirituality. Everything else should have been
Mm.
left. I think that's the only thing we didn't take from India.
Now, you write very openly about pain and healing in the body with holding on to what the mind might not understand yet, or maybe vice versa, or, it's all combined and it's kind of circular. But what is your journey teaching you as it's ongoing about the connection between spiritual awakening and emotional healing and physical healing?
That's a really good question. So before I'd been through this process, every few years I would have a really kind of explosion of anger and rage that would often kind of culminate in a kind of disastrous event for me in my life. I'd do something that would be a real kind of self-harming act, and when this process started and the pain started leaving me, I realized how much was there. And I realized how much stored pain that my ego could call on to put me through these kind of catastrophic life events, because I'd suppressed all of this stuff. Like I was bullied at school for being too overweight, and I'd gone through my career self-sabotaging.
Mm-hmm.
I actually had quite a successful and interesting career in music, but I was constantly self-sabotaging myself. And the whole time it was because I was listening to this internal dialogue, and I'd keep a lid on things. But every 3 years, this pain would all rise to the surface, and I'd have get into a fight, or it would all kind of explode out. And then I'd go back to normal for a bit. But that process now doesn't happen,
Mm. Wow.
because a lot of the pain and tension, as the Kundalini Shakti has cleared a lot of that out. And it actually comes out as a physical feeling. So, and it comes out from different areas of the body, and you realize, wow. And some of it's quite painful, actually. Often people say, a lot of people won't go through this kind of, or find it very difficult to go through this healing process. And again, that's where surrender comes in. There's nothing you can do about it. You just kind of, so for instance, what I would do is I would lie down and just be present, and I would feel pain leaving the soles of my feet, the tops of my feet, the legs, all different areas of the body. And each kind of area in the scriptures has a kind of, this area is linked to moving forward, and being within your own power. And
Right.
this area is linked to childhood pain, and this area is linked to. So this has been actually well documented in terms of the different areas where pain leaves, and people have experienced these things. And now I feel I'm much, much calmer. Now it's still some there. The process still hasn't finished. I think it started last Easter properly, when I first started noticing, oh
Yeah.
wow, yeah. And it leaves in different ways. Sometimes it's kind of quite intense, and sometimes I've had to have like a day off work the next day because it's kind of been overwhelming, and makes you very, very tired. Other times it's like little short, sharp shocks, like needles being removed. Other times it's like a kind of fizzing of pain that kind of leaves an area. It's very strange, to be honest.
Yeah.
Very strange.
I get that though. I mean, I don't think it ever really leaves you because, well, if you're open to growing and learning, I don't think that it'll ever really stop. It's when
Right.
you kind of shut it off that's.
Well, so one of the things I found interesting was ancestral pain.
Mm,
And again, Sherry, what can I say? All I can tell you from this experience is I can't sit here in this interview and say to you, "Oh yes, God is real, Sherry. That's true. That's for absolutely sure."
hmm.
But what I can say with my own personal experience is that there are levels to consciousness that it's possible to access, that are beyond the ego, that feel autonomous, that feel like they are God acting through you,
Right.
whether and that it clears pain out of your system, and it quietens the ego, and yes, it does do all those things. Now, whether it's supernatural or not is down to faith. And I do believe, because it feels like the divine feminine,
Hmm.
if that's what it feels like. But I can't sit here and claim that I know that God is real by any stretch.
Right.
But I know
Right.
that it's improved my life no end. you know
Yeah.
Mundane tasks feel like driving to work. I drive to work now, and I just sit in presence with silence in my mind. I don't listen to the radio, and it's an enjoyable experience. Something that would be, in the old days, would have made me feel frustrated and, come on everyone, hurry up, and driving up, tailgating people. What do you call it in the States? I think you call it
Yeah.
tailgating, don't you? Yeah.
Road
So
rage.
yeah,
Yeah.
road rage. I'm just like, it's not like that anymore. It's a pleasant experience. It's like taking in the scenery, and just actually not missing life. Do you know what I mean by that?
Yeah.
Not missing my life.
Yeah.
Just because I'm doing something boring doesn't mean that I have to be miles away thinking about, I don't know, what I'm going to cook for dinner, or
Yeah.
eh, eh, well, usually something negative. Actually, will be how inadequate I am. But
R-
just to answer, I hope I answered your question there, and I didn't get too off the subject. I guess what I'm trying to say is that what the process did is that it stopped kind of old inherent patterns that were in me, where all of this stored pain would rise up, explode. I'd suppress it and keep it down, and be normal and function in the real world, and
Yeah.
try to find things like exercise and all that as an outlet. But there was too much of it there, and I couldn't control it, and it would all boil up and explode. And now this energetic awakening has kind of removed enough of it for me to be completely released from that pattern. At
Yeah.
least so far. Like nothing's happened for at least like 5-6 years,
Wow.
which is rare, right? Because
Yeah.
it was like a pattern in my life. Usually from alcohol as well. Like I don't drink anymore.
I get that. Yeah.
So anyway, I'm teetotal now.
There's nothing wrong with that. Now, you mentioned the book kind of wrote itself. I'm sure it was very cathartic, and putting it out there was for you as well. But also during the process, did you have thoughts that, hey, this could help others too?
I did. I felt there was a part of me, again, the ego was telling me, you can't put this book out because you're going to look like a total wimp if you put this book out.
Mm,
It's like all your masculinity is draining away with you writing this book. You're writing about having a experience with a kind of inner female deity, and everyone's going to
mm,
laugh at you, and no one's going to believe you, and they're all going to think you're crazy. That's the story that the ego was telling me. But I'd got to the stage where I was aware of this chatter and insecurity, and I thought, no, actually, I think the masculine part of me putting this book out is the fact that I actually had the guts to put it out in the first place. It's like, bosh, there you go. Here's a book. Here's a book from a man about an internal relationship with the female energetic deity, right? And
Love it.
this is for other men that may be experiencing this, that don't know what's happening to them, that they think they're going crazy. I mean, I wonder how many people, actually spend time that have these experiences, and the psychiatry doesn't know how to deal with it. They end up, in mental institutions or suffering, having mental breakdowns. And
Right.
that's what it was about. It was about, okay, I've had this experience and I'm going to tell a story. Because when I was writing it, I realized that there wasn't really, what I'd done didn't really exist. Not really. Yes, there were gurus talking about these kind of things, but there was no kind of heartfelt, okay, I'm a Western male. I'd kind of been told my whole life I've got to be macho. And so this whole kind of psychic scaffolding that I'd built had been stripped away. And I wanted to put that out there so that if there was other men experiencing this, that if they looked for something like that, then they would find it, hopefully. And
Absolutely.
I can't believe how many people have downloaded and read it, actually. I think the last time, I think it's done about 1,400 units so far since last August.
Wow,
So
that's amazing.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I couldn't
Yeah.
believe it, because when I put it out last year, I was like, okay, if this saves one person's life, it was worth it, right?
That tells me a lot, and that's why I love books like yours, because you're telling your story, but it's so important because, like you mentioned in the beginning, you felt all alone. Well, those
Yeah,
1,400 people were feeling alone too,
right.
and they found that connection with your book. I love that.
I
Yeah.
think one of the things I've noticed from Goodreads and things like that, and you can see who's reading your book. Women are reading it. I think women are much more open to this kind of thing. I want it to appeal to women too, because someone might see it and go, "Oh, hey, my husband or my boyfriend's having this experience, and maybe like this would help."
Yeah. Yeah. That's wonderful. I'm excited that you've had such great interest and, feedback, and that's wonderful. Now, you mentioned in the beginning when we first started talking that you maybe have another book in the works. So tell us a little bit about your upcoming book, and how does it build off of your first book, or how does it look different from your first book?
So the first book was really like a kind of whirlwind. It was a very mystical experience, and I it wrote itself very, very quickly. And I was able to write. I actually think I kept a diary for 6 months, but I wrote the book in 2 weeks.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was just all there, and a lot of stuff I left out. But the book I'm writing now is much more about integration and about the long term path and what it looks like, and it's much more grounded. It's still devotional, but it's much more grounded in terms of integrating the awakening into your everyday life, coming back to Kansas, so to speak,
Okay. Yeah.
and actually kind of living with the experience, almost like the after awakening story, which again, I don't think gets told as
Mm-hmm.
much. But actually, the first book is essentially very mystical in terms of the experience. Now, that doesn't last forever, and then it's like what it's like after that happens, how to integrate this experience, how for instance, I do yoga every day, prayer every day, practicing the present moment, the kind of feelings, how much pain is left, all these kind of living with awakening, basically, and integrating it into everyday life.
Right.
So
Okay.
that's what the next book's about. Yeah.
Okay. Any plans to get it out by a certain time?
As I'm a teacher, I get long summer holidays,
Mm.
and I've already written something like, because as I go around and in my everyday life, something might occur to me. Like, for instance, today I had this realization that a lot of the time when people preach about being present and about being in the moment, they're also talking about, if you're going through hardship in your life, try and calm the waves by being present. A lot of people look for these kind of answers to
Mm.
stop the mental noise when they're being present. But I had this realization today that applies to happiness too. Because it's easy to be swept up when you're swept up in joy, and the mind starts racing. And so, the wave rises and falls. So if you seek presence when times are tough, then, it's about when the wave rises and you feel really good in your life as well. It's about bringing presence to those moments too, so that you stay on a level and you're not just battered around by the waves of life. Now I'm sad. Now I'm happy. Now I'm
Yeah.
sad. Now I'm happy. Do you
Right.
see what I mean? So, and again, I realized that today, and I felt that was quite, I don't know, not like, that people will have their own opinions on these ideas, and I'm sure I'm not the first person to say them, but I felt that was quite a mature observation. I'd never thought about it before. I thought, oh yeah, you can get swept up in sadness and difficulties and problems, but you can also get swept up in and being elated and joyful. And it's great to feel like that, but it's just about bringing presence and awareness to all of your experiences in life.
Yeah.
So that will be the kind of thing that I'm writing about next. And when I think about this stuff, I just keep a diary. I've got about 36 little chapters ready to go. So in answer to your question, I'm hoping to maybe finish it this summer and get it out. But I want to leave it a decent amount of time, so I have actually enough time to talk about, okay, this is where the first book finished in like
Yeah.
July last year. And so, now it's been another year and this is what it's like now. So I don't want to rush it, because it's kind of writing itself, but it's a much slower process.
Yeah. And there's no reason to rush it. Yeah. I
Right,
mean,
exactly. Because again, I say, Sherry, I never intended on being an author. And I think I should write another book, to follow it up. But I'm not sure if I want to write any more after that. It's a labor of love, isn't it? Writing a book.
right.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping that, I'm not pretending that I have any more insights than anyone else, but it feels like the experiences that I'm having through the awakening process are things that I want to get down, and things that, again, that hopefully might be helpful to someone who's been through the same situation.
Absolutely. Now, do you have a website for listeners and readers who want to learn more about you and maybe pick up your book?
Yeah, I do. The book is available on Amazon, Kindle, and in hardback. Every few months, you can get the book for free, because Kindle allow you to do free promos. So the book will be
Mm-hmm.
available for free every few months. And I have a website called jamescromptonauthor.com.
Okay. All right. Wonderful. Well, James, thank you so much for joining me today on the show. And it's been really eye-opening, and I've completely enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you very much, Sherry. I really appreciate you having me on, and all the best.
Thank you so much for joining me today for my interview with James Crompton, author of The Divine Feminine. You can learn more about James and his work at jamescromptonauthor.com. And be sure to check out our other interviews at InsideScoopLive.com.